Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, you may press star 1 at any time to enter the question queue. This conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I will now turn the meeting over to Luke Feinberg. Thank you. Please begin.
Thank you very much. Hi, this is Luke Feinberg with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I am a project coordinator working on the York Bight, and I'm going to kick off today's webinar, which you'll hear from many of our staff. So thank you again for participating. We really appreciate your willingness to engage in this process. And if you're on the phone line today or even hearing this on the recording, you are a stakeholder with a vested interest in what we're doing here in the Outer Continental Shelf. And as the regulators of renewable energy actions on the Outer Continental Shelf, we do take this responsibility seriously and recognize that this means becoming part of the offshore wind community, and very much appreciate the opportunity to have this webinar and your attention today. So what we're going to do today is talk about the York Bight specifically, and the call for information and nominations that we received, and specifically the comments on the call for information and nominations we received. Really, we're going to try and describe the analysis that we've used to look at the various uses of the ocean space and how those comments we received are being incorporated, and hopefully obtain some feedback from those on the phone about those comments and our analysis to incorporate as part of our area ID and leasing considerations. So to accomplish that, I'm going to provide a little bit of just offshore wind context in general, where we are, why we're talking about the York Bight. I'll try and lay the baseline for the BOEM process to make sure we're all on the same page and discuss the process moving forward. We will summarize the call for information and nominations, including a discussion of the nominations we received. And then you will hear from several of our subject matter experts, and they'll specifically describe comments that were received in response to their specific questions or specific subject matter areas, and discuss the analysis that they're conducting and some initial recommendations that they'll be making as part of this process. This is very much trying to make this an open process. This is a culmination of 4 events. We had 3 meetings in Long Island, New Bedford, and Long Branch. And this webinar is being recorded, and hopefully those that aren't able to make those meetings are either able to make this webinar or can listen to it afterwards. But very much looking for your feedback, and we'll have an open question and answer session at the end of each presentation. So I want to make very clear of what you will hear and what you will not in terms of meeting expectations. We very much intend to describe how your comments are being used, the subject matter specific analysis that is being conducted, and the recommendations at this point in time that are being put forth because of that. And note that you're going to see a lot of maps today, and those maps are very much likely to change as we move through this process. It's very much an iterative process, and so don't necessarily get married to one thing, but this is something that we will be refining as we move forward. And to be clear, you will not be hearing any final decisions from us on the area identification process. We could not make final decisions now without gaining your inputs. This is part of that effort. And we're not either going to hear specific areas that BOEM is recommending as wind energy areas, but more a framework by which we'll approach that. So what is the renewable energy process? At a high level, it has 4 stages, and this is really from beginning to when you would, of our leasing process to when you would start operations. The first stage is planning and analysis, followed by the actual leasing stage. Once we have a lessee on board, there's a site assessment stage. And then finally, we have a construction and operations stage. Just want to make sure everybody is aware of this at a high level, and we'll zoom in a second. So the Office of Renewable Energy Programs has been around for a number of years. Our regulations were promulgated in 2009. And as a result, we have 12 active commercial leases on the Atlantic coast, and upcoming sales at the end of this year in Massachusetts, and following that will be a sale in New York, which is much of the topic of discussion today, or New York Bight, I should say. We have 6 approved site assessment plans, which is the first major step in our leasing process, and are currently processing 2 construction operations plans, and those are for Vineyard Wind and Deepwater Wind South Fork projects. So those are the main activities happening on the East Coast. We also have several activities on the West Coast where planning continues off of Hawaii, the Carolinas, and as the topic of discussion today, the New York Bight. And then we also had a task force meeting out in California recently discussing their call for information and nominations. So there's a lot going on, as you can tell, and the area in light green you can see in the upper right-hand corner is the New York Bight, and that is the zooming into the map here, and this is a call area. So this is where the process really starts. Hopefully most of you on the phone are familiar with this map, but you'll see many renditions of that today. So here's our process again in those 4 stages: planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and construction operations. We're going to be focusing on the initial portion today, the planning and analysis portion, so we'll zoom in there a little bit here. So you can think of this as a winnowing down process, or a process of narrowing down certain areas. You start with a larger area or a larger box, and through a series of steps, deconflict and narrow things down to the point where you end up with lease areas. So it starts with this call for information nominations. That was for the New York Bight, that was released in April of this year. That was followed by a comment period, and once that comment period ended, we're now in the area identification stage. And as you see with this little marker here, that's where we are right now. And the purpose of the area identification stage is to identify wind energy areas. And I note that there are several opportunities for public comment in sort of the formal process, as you see by those gray bars, both in response to the call for information nominations and at later stages. But there's also several efforts we're trying to undertake in order to increase transparency. So these meetings are an example of that. Having task force meetings at key stages in the process are also an example of that. So as you see in this graphic, there are several potential task force meetings. We had one in response to the call for information nominations. I'll discuss, we'll likely have on Area ID and then further down the road as well. But once you end up with a wind energy area, essentially what that does is the next step in narrowing things down, and it identifies an area in which we can conduct an initial environmental assessment for site assessment and characterization activities. So putting a buoy out on your site and also doing some initial geotechnical and geophysical investigations. But once those wind energy areas are identified, we also kick off not only our environmental assessment process, but also the leasing documentation process. And the first document developed there is a proposed sale notice. And one of the important things that is contained within the proposed sale notice is the actual lease area that will be leased, what we're proposing to lease. So that lease area in the proposed sale notice does not have to be the entire wind energy area, but it is likely going to be a subset of it. So you'll have a large box with a call, smaller box with wind energy areas, and even smaller box potentially with a lease area. That proposed sale notice is followed by public comment, likely some sort of task force engagement, and then we will respond to public comments by making edits to a final sale notice and releasing that, and we'll have the details of an auction. So that's the leasing analysis portion, or planning analysis portion of our process. So the call for information and nominations for the New York Bight, the comment period on that closed on July 30th of this year. We received 132 comments, and thank you, first of all, to many of you that are on the webinar today. And just seeing the names show up, I noticed a lot of you did send comments in, and I appreciate the time you spent to do that. You know, we take these comments very seriously. I've read all of them, and our subject matter experts, as you'll see later on today, have all delved into the comments that we've received. And they did represent a very diverse group of opinions and group of stakeholders, ranging from a sentence to over 70 pages in detailed documentation analysis. Really, members of the general public, federal, state, local agencies, fishing industries, maritime industries, developers, ENGOs, universities, a pretty good mix of folks there. So thank you again for your time and putting those comments together. So it is a call for information and nominations. And so these nominations are from companies that, developers that indicated an interest in moving forward with occupying a lease in the New York Bight. So we basically asked them where in the New York Bight would they be most interested in developing. So this map here shows the areas that were nominated as well as the 9 companies that nominated them. And the map is trying to show a density of where nominations took place. So if you see the blue lines encompass the call areas, and there are areas within the call that do not have any shading or are just that gray background. That means that no company specifically identified that as a nominated area. I'll caveat that with saying that several developers, while they did not specifically nominate those spots, did indicate a willingness, a general willingness to occupy a lease and develop a lease wherever it is in the New York Bight. They really just wanted to get in the game, so to speak. So it's slightly misleading that those aren't colored. But then we go from one nomination being that dark green color all the way to red at 5 nominations. So if you look at Hudson South, for example, you'll see a majority of the nomination density is focused there. And on those red cells, each of those aliquots, you'll see that if it is red, that means 5 of the companies to the right nominated that as a potential spot to move forward. So I'll just note here that this is one of many sets of data that we utilize in order to make a decision for our area ID process. It's a very important piece, but it is certainly not the end-all be-all. This is one of those maps that is an example of one of the many things we consider. The other piece of information that I'd highlight here is you'll notice that there are 2 green nominations that are located outside of the call areas to the southeast or east of the call areas in deeper waters. And those were nominated in response to the call because we specifically asked developers, if you have interest in areas that are deeper than 60 meters, which is generally the cutoff and generally the depth at which bottom-founded technologies are thought to be cost prohibitive. If you have interest in deep waters or floating technologies, let us know and let us know where you think the New York Bight you would like to proceed with that. So we did have a nomination come outside the call areas in deep waters, and that's certainly very important to our planning process, and it will be considered as part of this process moving forward as well as other processes as we continue our planning approach. So what does the road ahead look like? As I mentioned, we do plan to have a task force meeting mainly revolving around area ID. And that is scheduled for November 28th of this year, likely to be held in New York City. And the topic of that conversation will likely be draft wind energy areas. BOEM intends to make some decisions to develop draft areas by early November, which will be released to the task force. And the thinking is that the task force will then have some time to review the draft and provide comments at the task force meeting at the end of November to advance the conversation and help us as a program to identify those final wind energy areas, which we anticipate in early 2019. So hopefully with this presentation, you've got a sense of the process that we're going forward with, and you have a sense of what you're going to hear during this webinar. But certainly if there are any process questions or overall questions, I'm happy to try and answer that now with the folks in the room here as well. So the operator, would you mind opening the line? We can take some questions.
Absolutely. At this time, if you have a question, first please ensure your phone is unmuted, then press *1 and record your name to enter the question queue. Once again, that is *1 at this time if you have a question. Let's take just a moment to queue up. Please stand by. I do have one coming in. Stand by, please. Okay, so we have a question here from George. Your line is open, George.
Yeah, good afternoon. I've got 3 or 4 in a row here. what's going to happen when you start the construction on these? What's going to happen to the commercial fishermen for 2 or 3 years where there won't be any fish around in areas where we work? We can't get around in construction areas. First of all, have you done extensive studies on what they do to whales and turtles, on all the electronic missions off the lines that are coming in? And the sharks, they all navigate with and feed on navigational to the electrical currents. It's going to mess them up. And what about all the birds? You're putting all these right in the flyways in one of the richest fishing grounds in the United States. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for your question. This is Brian Hooker. I'm a subject matter expert with BOEM.
What's your name, sir?
Brian Hooker.
Brian, okay.
So a lot of your questions revolve around a later stage in the leasing process that Luke referred to when we get to a construction and operations plan, when we actually understand what might be proposed in the area that we're considering. However, at the same time, we have an environmental studies program where we've been looking at a lot of the environmental effects that you raised.
Yeah, but who's doing that, sir? Who's doing that study? Because we don't know of any. But can you at least let us know who it is, please?
Well, there's multiple agencies now currently collecting information, baseline information. Remember, we only have one project that's actually been built in the U.S. that's off of Block Island. And we do have, BOEM has funded a project looking at the environmental effects of that particular project. But in the meantime, we are collecting a lot of baseline information regarding protected species and fish and modeling bird densities along the Atlantic coast as well. And at the same time, we're also learning from the experiences in Europe, where those experiences are applicable to what we anticipate on the U.S. Atlantic coast.
Well, they've decimated the porpoise population in the North Sea. They're almost extinct. So what's going to happen to our whales, our turtles, and dolphins on our East Coast?
The harbor porpoises are sensitive to marine noise, and they have...
So are our whales, everything else, sir.
Sharks.
So go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. I apologize. Go ahead.
But my point is that sensitivity, there are protocols in place to help reduce that noise, that acoustic impact to protected species and fish.
How is that? And how is that, sir? I mean, can you explain how you're going to do that? Because you're putting them right in the whale calving sanctuary in South Carolina, turtle nesting areas, bird sanctuaries, the horseshoe crab sanctuary, because that's what I do. I supply 90% of the world with horseshoe crab blood, and that's a sanctuary. That's a protected species with the red knots and everything else. The Atlantic sturgeon, the right whales, they also have calves in that area too. So, I mean, can you answer those kind of questions for me? Because none of that's been studied, none of it. And it's going to take a while to do these studies. I mean, can you answer that for me, please?
Hi, this is Jaron Ming. I'm also with BOEM, and I'm an environmental coordinator. There will be a presentation a little bit later on how we gather comments and address comments related to...
Sir, that's not answering my question. Can you answer my question, please? I'm trying to be nice. I just want somebody to answer my question. It has not been studied. I've watched whales. I got videos of whales running into our piers here off of Ocean City that I've never seen in 55 years I've been fishing. Never. We're seeing stuff in the ocean, the dolphins and porpoises that are dying, washing up on the beaches and stuff. We've never seen that happen before. I just want somebody to answer these questions for me. And nobody seems to want to answer them because we need it studied.
Well, there are a number of studies that BOEM has funded, and you can find those on the BOEM website. If you go to BOEM.gov, then there's a section specifically for studies that we've done on renewable energy, and you can look at many of those, and they may be helpful in answering some of those questions you have.
And George, I really do appreciate you. This is Luke Feinberg. I appreciate you asking these questions. They're important to our process, and I do want to allow us to move on a little bit to get a few more questions in. And as Jaron said, he will be giving a presentation in a few minutes to actually, I think, you're next here. So we're going to take a few more questions. And I would just remind you, too, that the specific stage that we're at in our process for the New York Bight, we're just thinking about the New York Bight, is fairly early on. So a lot of the questions you're talking about, while very, very important, we need specific information in order to analyze. So we need to know what exactly someone will be proposing, what they'll be building, in order to understand how we could potentially mitigate it. So I really appreciate that.
And this is the operator. At this time, there are no further questions.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was the next slide. So my name, as I mentioned earlier, is Brian Hooker. I'm a biologist with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs. As Luke mentioned, we have received several comments on the New York Bight call areas, with roughly half of those comments received were in relation to issues related to fisheries and fishery resources. So some examples of comments that we have received are on this slide. This one's focusing primarily on comments from state and federal agencies. A lot of state and federal agencies provided us with very, very good data on activities that they were concerned, fishing activities that they were concerned about regarding their constituencies. The National Marine Fisheries Service as well provided a very in-depth, lengthy response with a lot of data on all of these areas as used as a fishery. And it's our anticipation that through this process, as Luke mentioned at the beginning, we'll be winnowing down these areas into smaller areas and then kind of applying that same set of data against the smaller areas to assess those areas as we move forward. So regarding comments from the industry, fishing industry, this is, again, just a high-level look at some of those comments. They're just examples of some of the comments. Some general themes are obviously, as the gentleman earlier described, all these areas are used for different fisheries. Some felt that the areas that we should be considering should be closer to shore, and then there was a lot of comment regarding the design of leases and the design of the facilities, and the importance of ensuring that facility design configurations are considered at even as early as the auction phase or lease issuance stage to ensure that fishing concerns are addressed as early in the process as possible before leaseholders bid into state RFPs, requests for proposals. We did get, as the slide shows, the surf clam, and at least a member of the surf clam and ocean cog industry did provide some information regarding areas of lesser conflict. Those are the areas in light blue. Other members of the industry provided, again, that design aspect, and that's that dark blue rectangle in the middle saying that, well, if facilities were, if lease areas were long and skinny, in a certain orientation, that would reduce the amount of impact with fishing activities because a fishing vessel wouldn't, have to go through that many, one or two rows of turbines versus an entire field of turbines. And as the previous commenter also suggested, commenters also stressed the need for studies and cumulative impact analyses. So the next slides, I'm going to kind of walk through some of the lessons learned from previous planning and analyses that we've done in the area in regards to understanding the use of the area as a fishery. The National Marine Fisheries Service has provided us with a wealth of data for the Northeast region, and really trying to understand how to use those. That data set has been a learning experience. So, one thing that we've learned early on is that if we used the value of the fishery alone, we might be swamping out smaller fisheries that don't have such a high dockside value as others. So what we did was, using that same basic VTR-based information, provided a relative index. So this is the importance of that area to that particular fishery in a year. And then we did that for all the top 6 fishery management plans that were operating in these call areas. And then, knowing that we really wanted to build there's some drawbacks to VTR-based alone, we wanted some actual, more precise vessel location information. We turned to 2016 AIS, where it was either categorized as other or fishing based upon their AIS login. And so we combined those two to then create this fishing relative use index. And so what you can see here is the cooler areas, shades of blue, reflect the lesser relative importance of an area in its use as a fishery. And again, emphasizing that all this area is heavily used, so this is it's relative to itself, relative to each fishery, how important these areas are using that index. And that then again can give us these blocks based upon those lighter shaded blue areas that we can say, okay, this is where our subject matter expert analysis is leading us, and look at some other aspects that were received in comments. So as I mentioned, some of the comments that we actually did receive specific recommendations, either from the commercial fishing industry. I didn't really necessarily point out, but it was on the slide. The state of New Jersey recommended removing some of these particular recreational fishing areas. These are the New Jersey sport fishing areas that are included on this image that you're looking at here. It may be hard to see, maybe a little washed out on your slide, I'm sorry. But combining all those together to try to identify, areas that could support a commercial wind energy area was the next step. So that gave us this least conflicted areas map. It's primarily, as I mentioned, the combination of the index value with, and then the looking at the primary recommendation areas were where there was good agreement with some of the impact, some of the responses we heard from the commercial fishing industry in the comments on the New York Bight call area. Areas that are removed here that were on the previous map, there was it's called the George's Bank area. It's not the real George's Bank, but it was identified as George's Bank on the New Jersey Sport Fishing Atlas that was in the southern part of the Hudson North area, and then also the Triple Rex area in kind of the southeastern portion, the kind of eastern point of the Hudson South area, and it removed those wreck sites. Only one of the wreck sites was actually in the lease area, where the others were outside the call area. Excuse me, the call area, not lease area. So again, we wanted to try to emphasize some of what Luke talked about at the beginning with regards to next steps. So these are still very large areas, especially in Hudson South. That Hudson South area is, over 415,000 acres. So, how to reduce that further. These are examples of what a lease area could look like in those areas. It could support 2-3 lease areas if we're using an 80,000 acre site as an example a size to support 800 megawatts. So again, these are just examples to, again, emphasize that there's another level of analysis that will still need to happen in regards to what actual lease areas look like out of the SME recommendations. Lastly, so a lot of comments also, as I mentioned earlier, talked about different mitigations that we could put or consider at this stage, whether it be requiring in the lease or some other vehicle that the cables be buried at 6 feet throughout the area. The requirement that future construction operations plans include fishing navigational corridors, and also that the requirement that COPs include the construction operations plan include fishing gear compensations plan, and or where necessary, fishing revenue compensation plans. So that's kind of it. My contact information is there on your screen. My name again is Brian Hooker. Amy Stillings is our industry economist. She's done several of these presentations as well. And between the two of us, we can do our best to answer your questions. We will be having a BOEM open office this week, actually tomorrow, at the New England Fishery Management Council meeting in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And then we'll be at the, similarly, we'll be on October 2nd at the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting in Cape May, New Jersey. We'll be opening the lines now for quick questions. There'll be more time at the end for additional questions. We want to ensure there is enough time to give you all the information from our subject matter experts. Please remember your feedback is important and essential to our process.
Thank you. At this time, once again, press star 1 if you have a question. Please unmute your phone and record your name when prompted. Once again, star 1 for questions. Stand by, please. And once again, as a reminder, to ask a question, please press star 1 to enter the question queue. Stand by, please. We have a question here coming from Karen Chitello. Karen, your line is open.
Thank you very much. Hi, Brian. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the fishing gear compensation plan. Now, would that be inclusive of all the cables and the cabling lines, or just the facility, the wind farm itself, or what? Just curious.
Well, in that particular slide, we're talking about comments that we received that people would like to see more fully fleshed out and required more explicitly earlier in the planning. As you know, right now we are in the process of working through an environmental impact statement for our first commercial wind energy project, and as through that EIS process, I think we're really going to help flesh out some of those questions that you have regarding what might be included in a gear compensation plan, whether it's any gear compensation for any facility that is laid down and is supposed to be free of obstruction and identified so on a chart, or some other avenue. I mean, we have lots of examples from the UK and how this is done, and I think even in the US we've had a couple developers make available gear compensation plans that are publicly available. But that is part of what we'll be putting out for public comment in the Vineyard Wind EIS in the near future. So, yes, to answer your question, gear compensation would likely include any facility that is put in place by the lessee.
And once again, as a reminder, press star 1 to enter the question queue. We have a question from Charles Snow. Your line is open, Charles.
Hi. So my question is related to the recreational fishing. I've seen different studies that show these the offshore wind farms kind of acting as artificial reefs. Is it the case that recreational fishing will be allowed within the wind farms themselves?
Yeah, I mean, obviously navigational and safety risk is more in the wheelhouse of the U.S. Coast Guard. But as a practice and as the U.S. Coast Guard has stated in several meetings, they have no intention of restricting any access to the facility. Block Island Wind off of Block Island, Rhode Island, being an example, there is access to those 5 turbines by the recreational and commercial fisheries. I think the only restrictions would be on tying to the facilities because they are private property. But in general, there's no restrictions on access.
Once again, press star 1 if you have a question. Stand by 1 moment, please. Looks like I've got no further questions coming through at this time.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Jaron Ming again. As I mentioned, I'm an environmental coordinator in the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and I'm here to speak to you a little bit about the comments that we received related to environmental and biological resources. This slide is just an overview. I'll focus most of the presentation today on visual impacts and impacts to marine mammals and protected species, because that's where the majority of environmental comments that we received. It should be noted that there were other considerations, including sea turtles and avian species. So there's other things that maybe won't be fully addressed in the presentation today that were still taken into consideration when we made our when we accepted comments and when we recommended call areas. So the way I'll start is just go over a summary, high level of the types of comments that we received on a particular subject, and then how we analyzed that information. When it came to visual impacts, we received a number of comments that recognized that this area along the coastline of the New York Bight is densely populated with numerous historical landscapes. We also received comments that suggested the visual impacts are subjective, lower risk, and not fairly rated against other impacts. We also received comments suggesting that there is new lighting technology available that should be taken into consideration in making our decision. And there was also a suggestion that there should be additional siting criteria, specifically that siting should be at least 20 statute miles from the coastline. So with those comments, as we took them under consideration, we held meetings with National Park Service, Shinnecook, and other states that are affected. We consulted the state historic preservation officers. We also referred to the New York Visibility Threshold Study. We also considered nighttime lighting options, and we recognized that when it comes to visual impacts, the logical conclusion is the further away from the coastline, the smaller the impact, and there was a recognition that reduction of impacts drastically or begins at about 20 statute miles from shore and drastically reduces at any distance after that. There was a suggestion that at about 35 miles from the coast, there is almost negligible or no impact visually. So taking that into consideration, we produced this graphic. There is a blue line that shows the 17 statute mile buffer as it relates to the call areas. As you can see, that information was taken into consideration when identifying call areas. And there are just a few areas that are just slightly impacted by that 17-mile buffer. One of the other considerations for visual impacts was a 20-mile buffer. So if we extended it just a little bit further, which reaches that threshold of significantly reducing visual impacts, and it eliminates just a few areas off the coastline. They're shaded in a lighter green in this visual. Moving on to marine mammals and protected species. Again, just a high-level summary of comments. There are a number of cetaceans or whale species and sea turtles and other protected species in this New York Bight area to be considered. As was mentioned and identified earlier in this session, there is the potential for noise pollution during surveying and construction, as well as operation and maintenance of these facilities. Also, as previously mentioned, there are other impacts such as EMF, air and water quality, and potential vessel strikes as activity increases in this area. And we also received a number of comments requesting or suggesting the funding of additional data collection studies. So with those comments, particularly comments from the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is the federal regulator over marine mammals, there was information they provided us recognizing a biologically important feeding area for fin whales and the presence of North Atlantic right whales near the call areas in the New York Bight. In particular, the fairways north, the northernmost call area that we identified, potentially conflicts with that biologically important feeding area. As a result, the National Marine Fisheries Service recommended that we include a 10 statute mile buffer around that biologically important feeding area. And they also recognize the need for pre- and post-construction monitoring. This is a visual just to give you a frame of reference to where some of the information that we have related to the density of whales in the area shows that the more dense areas are further offshore than the call areas. But we recognize there is the potential, since these are mobile and migratory species, that they could be in many other areas. So based on that information, we identified the biologically important feeding area for the fin whales, which is in this slide shaded in blue. As you can see, it's in the northernmost part and just barely touches some of those northern areas in the fairways north. And based on the recommendation from the National Marine Fisheries Service, there is a potential option to include a 10-mile buffer, which would remove the lighter green shaded areas. And that's an option that is under consideration. Additionally, similar to fishing, and as we've mentioned before, this is a very early planning stage, so there are a number of considerations for later in the process. It's important to note that this is just information that we're considering for area identification. We haven't reached a decision on any of those areas yet. And in addition to that, as was touched on previously, there's the potential for additional narrowing of the areas to identify leases, where leases would be issued. And even after that, there could be smaller areas that are impacted by the actual construction of the turbines. So keeping all that into consideration, we will, in the future, keep in mind potential mitigations, such as seasonal restrictions to minimize impacts, as well as speed limitations for vessels in hopes of reducing vessel strikes. We also received recommendations that we consider lease and turbine siting considerations as we approach a construction phase in the process further down the road. We also received comments suggesting monitoring and adaptive management during the process. And as I mentioned, numerous comments suggesting additional funding for studies. As I mentioned, my name is Jaron Ming, and my contact information is available on this slide. And if you have questions, feel free to email them to me or to call me. And now we can open up the lines for just a few questions, if there are any. But we probably won't take more than a handful so that we can move on to some of the other presenters and make sure we get through all the information.
Thank you. Once again, at this time, press star 1 if you'd like to ask a question. Again, star 1 for questions. Stand by, please. We have a question coming from Matt Gove. Your line is open, Matt.
Hey, this is Matt from Surfrider Foundation. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm not sure if I missed this or if you guys are working on something or waiting for the EIS process and on the construction plans, but seems like it'd be pretty easy to do a few visualization models, or I don't know what you want to call them, photoshops from a few different places around the region. Get some data from the Weather Service on, clarity, how far you can see, and then I would think it would just be physics of how tall of a turbine you're talking about and where the person is looking. Are you guys going to come out with some of those? Because it really is hard for people to visualize what these are going to look like, and it seems like it'd be pretty easy to put something like that together. Thanks.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much for that question. That is something that will be addressed in more detail when we have more detail. Again, there is some consideration of visual impacts, and there are some studies that we refer to now, but we refer to them only in a general sense because we don't have the specific proposal in front of us. So as you mentioned, at a later stage, when we have an actual construction operations plan with specific information about the kind of project and the kind of turbine that will be used or proposed, that's the point in which we do our more thorough and detailed environmental review and analysis. And as you mentioned, it's an environmental impact statement, which is what we do for constructions and operations plan. And there we can do a detailed analysis on that.
Can I add to that quickly? This is Luke Feinberg. One of the benefits we have in the New York Bight is that there are other projects in the region, and this is not the first time we've looked at this region. So a similar study to what you're talking about was conducted for the existing Equinor lease, which is located in the New York Bight, and that is available. And also, the state of New York did a considerable amount of work before the call information went out, which included a visualization study. And that study was pretty well documents the issues in the areas of concern, sort of the visual viewpoints from a recreation or national historic landmark perspective, and that report was very informative to recommend or to the recommendations that we're making here. So as Jaren's saying, we will do a specific study, but we also have a good baseline information upon which our recommendations are made.
Once again, press *1 if you have a question. And we did have a question in queue from George. Your line is open, George.
Yes, sir. I want to go back to the recreational gentleman who asked about the Block Island wind farms. I was just up there about 2 weeks ago with 20 other fishermen, and there is no fish around the wind farms, and you can see them at 15.5 miles away on a clear day, no problem. What size windmills are you wanting to put up in all these call areas now? Are the 680-foot ones or the 820-foot ones instead of the 300-foot ones? What size are you putting?
Thanks, George. Yeah, this is Luke Feinberg. I appreciate your question. That's a great point. So I just remind you sort of about where we are in the process specifically for the New York Bight, is we're sort of in that beginning stage, right? So we are not, our primary job is to provide access and make sure that it's done in a responsible and environmentally respectful way. And so we're not necessarily dictating what the size of a turbine would be. Basically what would happen is a developer would win a lease. They'd write us a couple of plans and reports and propose a certain size turbine in a call for information and nomination, in a construction operations plan. And that's the point where we would then take that and say, okay, you're going to propose a 10, 12 megawatt machine, and then we will conduct a visual study based on that. There is a proposal in from the construction operation plan off of Massachusetts that's proposed by Vineyard Wind. And I don't have the specifics in front of me, but that's an example of a time at which you will get the details of what a turbine would look like. And I just add that the details, you might not get the exact sort of the diameter of a turbine will be X amount of feet. The process by which a lot of companies are going with what's called design envelopes. They will give us a range. They'll say the turbines will range from size X to Y, and we generally will take the condition that would potentially result in the most environmental impact. So in that case, could potentially be the largest blade within the design envelope, and then conduct our analysis from that.
And I'm showing no further questions from the phones.
Hello, my name is Ariana Baker, and I have been the technical coordinator of this project. So for the first part of my presentation, I will share some of the analyses that have been done by our subject matter experts for cables, radar, and our wind resource. So first for cables, we received several comments on cables specifically involved with burying power cables at a sufficient depth to avoid interactions with fishing gear. The cable owners in the cable industry requested a separation from existing cables of about 750 meters and requested that coordination be done with existing cable owners. So very quickly, this is what the in-service cables look like in this area. As you can see, there are quite a lot. Most of them are fiber optic cables, which are those surface layered, small diameter cables, and these are all active. There are several more inactive cables, both coaxial, fiber optic, and also additionally telegraph cables, which are very much inactive at this point. So our subject matter expert for cables recommends that no areas should be removed on the basis of cables alone. That being said, they are a bit of a technical complexity for future developers. So it is something to consider in terms of how difficult and how expensive it would be for that particular developer to develop that area. But there are existing procedures for cable crossings and cable barriers that are fairly common in the industry. The next recommendation would be to maintain that separation distance between existing cable infrastructure and new renewable energy infrastructure. So that's 750 meters that comes from the North American Submarine Cable Association. Sorry, I'm trying to not say acronyms on the call today. And then again, the final recommendation would be to bury cables at an adequate target depth. So industry standard is 1.5 to 2 meters, which would avoid interaction with fishing gear. The next subject matter area that we have looked at is radar. So with radar, the main comments fell into a couple of buckets. The first one was marine vessel radar scattering for vessels within turbine arrays. And then the second area was the potential for impact on high-frequency land-based ocean observing radars. So these are more your military or weather radars that you'd come across. So I have a quick map here that just shows where some of those land-based radars are. Of course, marine radars are wherever the boats are, so wherever the vessel traffic takes us. But for the most part, there's only a few long-range radars that are in the area, and most of them are medium to short range. So again, the staff recommendations for radars are, after coordinating with our federal partners at NOAA and with the military, that there are no areas recommended for removal on the basis of radars. That being said, there are mitigation techniques that can be used to prevent some of that larger radar scattering. So for example, I know Rutgers University did a study that suggested that developers sharing their blade speed and orientation could be implemented into those mitigation algorithms to be processed on the back end by the radar owners. So the radars would be able to adapt the radars a little bit more accordingly. Finally, those areas are not viable if there is no wind to actually push the blades around. That being said, the wind resource in the Bight is more than sufficient to support projects on a commercial scale. As a metric for modeling what these look like, distance between turbines needs to be approximately 10 times the diameter of a turbine. And this will ensure that upwind turbines don't rob the downwind turbines of their power. Looking at buoy data and working with our friends at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we have found that the most frequent wind flow from that area is southwest, mostly summertime, followed by less frequent, though stronger wind flow from the west-northwest, more in the wintertime. So this is just a quick map of what the wind speeds are in the area. As you can see, most of them are well above 9 meters per second wind speed, and everything else is above 8.5 meters per second. So these are all very fast wind speeds, and just so you know, this is also a hub height wind speed. So this was developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it modeled wind speeds at approximately 90 meters above sea level to model what the wind speed would actually be at the center of a turbine. That being said, the hubs are getting taller now, so that wind speed only increases as you move up in the atmosphere. Additionally, this is a buoy taken from that northern end of the Hudson North Fleet. So this is from the National Buoy Data Center, and you can see that strong southwest sea breeze, and then again, that indication of a west-northwest breeze as well. So because of that, our meteorologist has recommended that adjacent facilities should not be leased in a direct north-south or east-west direction to prevent adjacent leaseholders from the upwind adjacent leaseholders from robbing the downwind adjacent leaseholders of some of their wind power. Additionally, as an industry standard recommendation, wind facilities of about 800 megawatts will require an area of about 80,000 acres. That being said, that is not final. That depends on what comes in the construction operations plan. That depends on the spacing and the orientation and the layout that different developers propose to us. But that is what we use as a pretty good rule of thumb to determine in what area we can fit that wind capacity. So this presentation is slightly disjointed. I'm also here in my capacity as a navigation analyst for BOEM, and I will be speaking about vessel navigation, mostly your deep draft and tug tow traffic that occurs within the New York Bight region. So fisheries got the most comments, but navigation got the second most comments, so we felt the need to include it on its own. Some of the groups captured, which I can see represented here today, include the American Waterways Operators, the World Shipping Council, the Maritime Association for the Port of New York and New Jersey, the U.S. Coast Guard, and Area Pilot and Towboat Association. So the main points of these comments were to implement the Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study Marine Planning Guideline buffers. So those are buffers that were laid out in the ACPARS document by the U.S. Coast Guard that states that there should be a buffer between any existing transit lanes from the edges of those transit lanes to any development of about 2 nautical miles. And there should be an additional buffer from the entrance and exit of those existing transit lanes of 5 nautical miles. Additionally, as you'll see when I go through some of my AIS vessel data, there should be a navigation corridor from Delaware Bay to Montauk or east of Montauk, Long Island for tug and tow vessels. And the reiteration that maritime concerns are safety concerns. The maritime industry isn't concerned about economics so much as they are with foreign vessels coming into New York Harbor and additionally coming into Delaware Bay that are not subject to the same expectations that the U.S. Coast Guard has of U.S. mariners. So this is just a quick map of all the vessels in 2016 that appeared in the New York Bight call area. Very quickly, what you're looking at is vessel automatic identification system data, or AIS data. This data, these transponders have been required on commercial vessels that I'm including in my analysis for quite a long time. So it is very reliable and it goes back quite a bit historically. So we can use it pretty easily. This data came from raw data from the United States Coast Guard that was processed in a joint BOEM and NOAA initiative on the marine cadastre. And then this is individual vessel counts within a 100-meter block throughout the whole area for the year 2016, which was then processed by the Northeastern Regional Ocean Council in their NROC data portal. So, of course, this is fairly meaningless in terms of trying to understand where to go. So I further broke it out into first tug and tow traffic. This is all that same data set, but with just tug and tow traffic from 2016. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of traffic that no longer hugs the coast as we're used to tug and tow vessels doing, but instead takes the more direct routes from Delaware Bay mostly to east of Montauk. This traffic varies in terms of how far out they venture, depending on the time of year and the weather conditions. So, respecting that, these are 2 possible options for tug-tow corridors. These are 9 nautical miles wide, looking at the recommendations that were put forward by the U.S. Coast Guard in the ACPARS document for finding the appropriate width for tug and tow corridors. These are just 2 options. The conversation continues with Coast Guard as to what the more appropriate route or corridor location should be. It is an ongoing conversation, and we will respect and very much appreciate Coast Guard's input in helping us determine where that corridor should go. Then you have the cargo vessels for all of 2016 in the New York Bight area. So again, you can see for the most part in that middle traffic separation scheme, which is the Hudson Canyon Ambrose traffic separation scheme, there's quite a lot of traffic that entering and exiting spreads very wide. For the most part, going through that Hudson South lease on the left, or Hudson South call area, apologies, on the left side, a lot of that vessel traffic is actually entering or exiting New York and then entering or exiting Delaware Bay. So that traffic is between New York and Delaware Bay, but it takes that middle traffic separation scheme to avoid some of the more busier coastal traffic along shore New Jersey and some of the speed restrictions that happen along that area as well. So, and then again, that traffic that heads east, going through Hudson North, is all traffic either headed to Europe or Africa. So there is an example of the AC PARS marine planning guideline buffers, with the orange being the 2 nautical mile buffer from the edge of existing traffic lanes, so those buffering out the traffic separation schemes, and then the red being the 5 nautical mile buffer from the entrance and exit of those TFSs. So again, this is the same map that exists just with tanker traffic. You can see the exact same patterns, and those patterns exist when you isolate it down to the individual vessel track lines. See a lot of those vessels going through the middle traffic separation scheme, transiting from New York to Delaware Bay, as opposed to taking the more direct route along New Jersey. And again, those AC PARS tugboat buffers. So combining all of these are the recommendations that we have come up with for vessel navigation specifically. It also includes a small weapons training area in the very north of the Hudson South area, and that was requested of us from the U.S. Coast Guard. So thank you. There is my contact information. We will now open to a couple of questions on what I presented specifically, and then I believe we're moving to questions on our presentations as a whole.
Thank you. At this time, as a reminder, press star 1 if you have questions on this presentation. Once again, star 1 if you have a question. Please stand by. Okay, we have several questions coming in. First question is coming from George Topping. Your line is open, George.
Ariana, do you hear me?
I can hear you, George.
How you doing? My big question is, have you ever been on a big vessel when you get near like metal objects and a lot of electrical current? What it does to your compasses and your automatic pilots? Have anybody taken that in consideration? Do you know what it does?
Well, that is part of the reason why Coast Guard recommends those marine planning guideline buffers of 2 nautical miles from the edges of a traffic separation scheme or any of the existing traffic routes. So that is part of the reason that goes into it, in addition to just keeping a barrier of separation.
Now you're going from like a 285-foot tower to a 680-foot tower to an 820-foot tower. That's a big. I don't even think you're close to where you need to be on them bigger towers. So I've been in the ocean for 55 years of my life. I've ran many radar and metal and compasses, and the more field of electric and more metal field you get, the more it's going to be. I don't even think you're close to what you got to do. So that's my opinion. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, George.
Please stand by for our next question. Next question is coming from Scott Mackey. Your line is open, Scott.
Ariana, thanks for your efforts here. One thing you did talk about when it came to cabling was a burial depth of 1.5 to 2 meters being the objective. Is there going to be some requirement for maintenance, regular maintenance on those burial depths? As we've seen, there's a lot of shifting that can take place in the ocean, even with the most recent project up off of Block Island.
Yes, that is a very good point. That is something that 1.5 to 2 meter cable depth burial is more of an industry standard that's come to us from the North American Submarine Cable Association. That being said, as we've been saying fairly often in this presentation, that is a mitigation that can be added to the terms of construction operation plan approval and can be analyzed in the environmental impact statement as well. So it is something that we're thinking of moving forward for. We do recommend 1.5 to 2 meters as the industry standard. that does not mean that we will not later require a deeper burial depth at a later stage.
Scott, this is Brian Hooker. We do have one project, a research project off Virginia, where it was the requirement did come through that after major storm events and at regular intervals that cable would have to be inspected for proper burial. So it is something that does come through in the construction and operations plan. I anticipate we'll have something similar for Vineyard Wind. And again, it can be different. It might be very differential depending on which area it is, where the greater hazards might be for sand waves uncovering cables, or those areas that maybe don't have a lot of high sediment transport. That would be a lower risk area. So it's definitely something that we'll be looking at.
And I would like to just very quickly, we do require quite a bit of study along those cable routes. So the developers would be well aware of what sort of substrate they are dealing with on the bottom and adjust those burial depths accordingly.
And this is the operator. It looks like I have no further questions coming in for this presentation.
So any other questions on the general process? We have plenty of time and happy to answer those as best we can.
Okay, so once again at this time, for any further questions that you have, press star 1 to enter the question queue. Once again, star 1 for your questions. Stand by, please. Okay, so we've got some coming in. Stand by, please. I have a question here, I believe, from David Wallace. David, your line is open. Hi, David, we can't hear you. Check your mute feature, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was interested in the notion that cables could not be closer than 750 meters from a telecommunications cable. I sort of wonder then how you're going to have arrays that are going to be constructed or laid out where they don't get anywhere near telecommunications cables, especially active ones, both off of Long Island and off of New Jersey.
Okay, David. So let me just put this caveat in that I'm not our cable expert in office. I will happily put you in touch with her. Her name is Jennifer Miller. But from my understanding in our conversations, that buffer set down by the North American Submarine Cable Association is really more so for cables that run in parallel. Cable crossing agreements are standard and well known. That being said, even if we did lease an area that straddled the cables, those developers would do the best that they could to minimize those cable crossings.
David, this is Brian Hooker. My understanding is, as Ariana said, it's more to be able to access those cables if they need to be maintained. They don't want to, hit another power cable if they're, going to go do basic maintenance on their telecommunications cable. So that separation distance is largely for to be able to maintain those cables and not interfere with each other's activities.
And once again, as a reminder, please press star 1 if you have a question at this time. We have another question here from George.
Sure.
Go ahead, George. You're open.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions. When I was in Block Island, I noticed the cable coming up on the beach was all exposed, and that was only after a year and 6 months after they installed that up there. What's going to stop the rest of these cables from being exposed like this? Anybody can answer that for me, please?
So, yes, And that is a very good point. We are aware of the Block Island cable, but that's something that we are taking as a bit of a lesson learned going forward, and we understand that a bit better now, so we can prescribe regular maintenance.
Well, I still got another question.
Construction operation plan approval.
Don't get off yet. I got another question, ma'am. Another thing, when I was up there is no fish around these windmills. None. Within 5 miles. None. When they turned them on, there was fish around them after they got them constructed. They waited for a month or so, and fish came back. And then when they turned them on, there is no fish around them. So why are you keep saying there's fish around them? And I know this for a fact. It was 25 of us that actually went there and did this. Hello?
I mean, George, this is Brian Hooker. I mean, I know that there's a long-term before and after trawl survey being conducted in that area, and I've recently at the American Fisheries Society, previewed some of the results of that, and they weren't able to detect any difference between.
Well, who was that, sir? Because I'm part of that people. I knew the people that just did that. Who told you that? Who gave you that information, sir?
That was at the American Fisheries Society. That was the captain of that vessel was there, Rodney Sykes, I believe his name is.
And the name of the boat, sir?
I'm not recalling the name of that particular vessel.
Well, there was no fish within 5 miles of those wind turbines, and that used to be one of the most productive areas off of Block Island.
I do get fishing reports from that area regularly, just through my Google alerts. I know that there are some recreational fishermen, maybe.
Was that like 3 or 5 miles around the windmill?
And send in fishing reports for that area.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Okay, now one more question for when you get to the Delaware Bay. That's the Schuster Sanctuary. That's protected for the horseshoe crabs, okay?
Protected against trawling for horseshoe crabs, correct.
That's what I do, rockfish, I do flounders, I do some sea bass, but I mainly do the pharmaceutical horseshoe crabs right around the Schuster Sanctuary.
That's federal water, so you shouldn't be doing rockfish in there.
Sir, I know that. I can't go outside of that. I'm talking about for my horseshoe crabs.
Okay, so you're talking inshore.
I do, and I don't like people laughing at me. I didn't laugh at you. Don't laugh at me. Okay?
Sir, I'm not. I'm trying to understand exactly where it is that you're talking about.
Schuster Sanctuary. I catch 90% of the horseshoe crab blood for every hospital in this country, Europe, and Asia comes out of our area. Okay, without my tracking device on, and it's going to destroy the Schuster Sanctuary, the red knot birds that are being protected, the whales that come in that area, the sturgeon that comes in that area. There's no studies have been done. I'm just saying, what's going to happen when you all come in there? What's going to happen to my job and the people behind me?
So if you're asking specifically about what the construction of an offshore wind facility will do to horseshoe crabs?
Sanctuary. How can you guys put stuff in a sanctuary? That's what I'd like to know. What gives BOEM permission, access to put them in the Schuster Sanctuary, the Cape Roman Sanctuary, the Turtle Sanctuary, the Whale Sanctuary? Who gives BOEM that permission to do that? And we can't even go in there.
The U.S. Congress is who gave us authority on the Outer Continental Shelf.
Well, no. Yeah, they did, but not in these sanctuaries. That's what I'm saying.
Regulations regarding the Horseshoe Crab Reserve are specifically toward targeted commercial fisheries in the Horseshoe Crab Reserve.
And George, that's a good question, and I'll add that our regulations, well, Brian is...
How come we can't go in these areas for turtles, whales, because everything else is in there, but you guys get exempted to do that and kill bald eagles and all that? That's something that... I just want somebody to answer my question, please. That's all. That's all I'm asking. I think it's a fair question. I'm not being mean about it. I'm just asking. Well, how do you get the right to go into a sanctuary like that, a protected area that's been here for 30 years, even the whale and turtle, especially the sea turtle sanctuary in Cape Romaine off of South Carolina, you're putting them right up on the beach. U.S. wind is. So how can you do this? I'm just asking.
I'm happy to answer your question, and thank you for your comment. I really do appreciate your participation in the call. I'll remind you that the purpose of this call here is the New York Bight. Doesn't mean we can't talk about other areas, but just want to be clear about that. But as Brian was saying, Congress is the one that gave us the authority for the Outer Continental Shelf. But what they also did was said that you cannot lease within a marine sanctuary. So we have not proposed to do that, and that is not something that we have currently authorized because we don't have the authority to do so.
Use of sanctuary and Deepwater and Skipjack, and also in South Carolina and Cape Romaine. They've got 500 sites down there. So you're telling me you can't do it?
That's correct. Well, I'm happy to follow up with you later if you'd like, but that's not something we have authority to do.
Well, and just to clarify Luke's point, I mean, he's talking specifically about national marine sanctuaries that are designated by NOAA and the National Ocean Service under their authority of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act.
And once again, as a reminder to participants, press star 1 to enter the question queue. And this is the operator. I am showing that I've got no further questions coming in at this time.
Well, thank you all. If you think of a question, I'm just going to have a few, just close things out a little bit, but please feel free to jump in. But we really do appreciate your time today listening on this webinar. And really, as a reminder, the purpose is to really make sure that we're correctly characterizing your comments that were received on the call so we can more accurately address them as part of our analysis. And some of the concerns that were addressed today, we're very much aware of, but they cover various species and multitude of issues that are a little challenging to address in this type of forum. It's not saying we won't talk about them with you, but the webinar may not be the best forum for that. But I just want to remind you that these issues are analyzed as we move through our process, specifically through an environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act, and that's something that comes a little bit later in our process for the New York Bight. But these analysis really do use the best available science, and any time that we can be made aware of new science or that is updated or new information, we're always searching for that. Brian mentioned earlier, we do include all relevant information, especially from the international experience. That is a lot of where the global experience for offshore wind is occurring, especially in Europe. We really want to make sure that what we're doing as a steward for the environment is done in a proper way and is proposed and executed in a way that is environmentally responsible. But that said, I think, this is a nascent industry, and we will not have all the answers from the start, but we do believe that BOEM's process provides for multiple opportunities for review. This, like I said before, this call, for example, is not something that we're necessarily required to do as part of our process, but we're trying to be as open and transparent as possible. And really make sure that we consider updated information as it becomes available. And I just also want to remind you that so we have this planning analysis process that eventually gets to a lease. And at that point, we have a new player in a lessee, a developer that comes on board. But the rights they receive as a lessee are not that exhaustive. Really, the only thing that a lessee is allowed to do that's different from someone else is to submit a plan to us for BOEM's review to conduct site assessment and characterization activities and surveys. So you can't go out there and do a survey even without submitting a plan to us for us to review. It does not provide any rights to a developer to build anything without making sure that we have a chance to review it, to make sure that we are reviewing it against our proper authorities and making sure that it's done in an environmentally responsible manner. And I also wanted to point out that this is not the first time that we are looking at the New York Bight. We do have the benefit of a lot of people's hard work conducting baseline data, doing several years and years of environmental analysis and long-term data sets that have helped inform our process. It doesn't mean we can't benefit from more data, but we certainly have a good baseline with this to work. So we really do appreciate your time today and making sure that we're analyzing this in the right way. And we very much appreciate your time this afternoon. And if you have any questions for follow-up that either you thought of now or you thought of after the webinar is over as you're driving home, feel free to reach out to me or any of the staff on the call here, and we can try and answer your question directly if you have specific questions. So again, You'll hear from us again at the early November with some draft wind energy areas, and then at a task force meeting November 28th. And we hope to be able to work with you as we move forward and answer any questions you may have. So thank you again, and any last questions, we'll take them now, otherwise we'll end the call.
I'm showing that I've got no questions coming into the queue.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Once again, with that, we'll conclude today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.